Right, it is now 16 minutes to 9. Let's take a look at the headlines on BBC News. And hundreds of people have joined a vigil for the primary school teacher Sabina Nessa, who was killed as she walked in south-east London exactly a week ago. The government urges motorists not to panic buy fuel as queues form at some service station forecourts amid fears of shortages due to a lack of delivery drivers. 3 school-aged children have been sentenced to a total of 28 years for killing Reading teenager Ollie Stevens in a beauty spot in January of this year. And now on BBC News, it's time to join Samira Ahmed for Newswatch.
Hello and welcome to Newswatch with me, Samira Ahmed. Does BBC News interviewing members of the Taliban risk normalising their views? Lise Doucette speaks to us from Afghanistan about dealing with the Taliban and how safe she feels reporting from there. First, Boris Johnson went to the United States this week, and so did the BBC's political editor Laura Kuenssberg, travelling as part of the Westminster lobby on board the Prime Minister's plane, where he personally briefed the journalists. On arrival in New York, she spoke to him one-on-one, asking him about the impact of energy price rises back home.
So if you look at our 10-point plan for the Green Industrial Revolution...
Forgive me, Prime Minister,
Laura,
I think at the moment people would like to know how they're going to put food on the table in the next few weeks and months, rather than thinking about a long-term 10-point plan.
Just on that, Laura, if I may, I don't believe that people will be short of food.
Sandra Hickman posed this question. Could you please explain why it was necessary for Laura Kuenssberg to fly to the USA to interview the Prime Minister when you already have American correspondents in place, and then to ask questions totally unrelated to his visit? Andrew Nash also got in touch with us with a concern about Laura Kuenssberg's line of questioning with the Prime Minister.
Last seen.
Why did she travel all the way across the Atlantic to New York to ask him things that could have been dealt with by a minister back at home? Shouldn't the BBC be doing this a lot better?
Well, we asked BBC News for a response on this, and they told us. As the BBC's political editor, Laura Kuenssberg covers all major political events, including important state visits abroad. It is her job to report detailed and impartial analysis of the biggest news stories of the day. Those problems with energy costs and other supply issues have dominated much of the week's news bulletins. But some viewers felt the BBC was making too much of the problems and doing real damage by doing so. Sandra Moran was one of them. I just don't get why there is so much news coverage about supermarkets struggling to keep shelves full. All you do is fuel the fire and make people panic buy. Just stop. If you stop, people won't rush out and buy everything, leaving nothing on the shelves for us normal people to buy. It's down to you to just shut up. Monday saw the first major expansion of the London Underground this century, with the opening of 2 new stations. David Walker saw the news on his phone and emailed. Today's headline news on the BBC app: 2 new London Underground stations open. How is this national news? How many people from Worcester or outside London will actually use them? Strange how the London-centric BBC didn't mention the new Worcester Parkway station opening. Do people in Worcester pay a smaller licence fee than Londoners? Now, the Taliban put in a request this week to address world leaders at the United Nations General Assembly. It seems unlikely to happen as no nation has formally recognised them as Afghanistan's new government. However, the Taliban are very much in power in the country, and that presents a challenge to journalists working there. If they deal with the Taliban and interview them as normal politicians, do they risk legitimising terrorists? That's the concern of Sanks P, who posted this on Twitter. BBC trying to normalise and mainstream the Taliban. And Satvi agreed. The BBC gladly gives a platform for Taliban terrorists to speak their point of view. What kind of journalism is this? Well, the BBC's Lise Doucette has received much praise from Newswatch viewers for her reporting from Afghanistan over the past few weeks. It's included a podcast series, A Wish for Afghanistan, in which she spoke, among others, to a founding member of the Taliban, Abdul Salam Zaif. She's been reporting from Afghanistan on and off since 1988 and recently posted this photograph of her at work as Soviet troops left the country in 1989. Well, I'm joined now by our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucette, in Kabul. Lise, we've just shown that photograph of you reporting from Afghanistan back in 1989. What was it like working there then?
Well, of course, it was such a different time, but a very same place. Those were the last days of the Cold War, the battles between the two big superpowers, the United States and the then Soviet Union, and Afghanistan found itself caught in the middle. And I remember so vividly at that time how Afghans would keep turning to me when they knew the last Soviet soldier had left in February of 1989 and saying, "Do you think things will get better? What do you think will happen next?" Remember, that was a time where there was no social media, hardly any media at all in Afghanistan. There were only 3 international telephone lines out of Afghanistan. So they looked to people like me to somehow give them a sense, an inkling of what would happen. And so it is breathtaking to think that now this is a country which has managed to live through, and so many have died, in more than 40 years of war. And it is, Afghans have still been asking me, is it going to get better? And it just, with every turning of the page, it just seems to get worse.
You've interviewed members of the Taliban for your recent podcast series. Do you worry about putting people like that on air?
Well, we put people on air all the time, Samira, as you know, to try to understand all, to use our expression, all sides of the story. We all have to understand, most of all Afghans, who the Taliban are, what their ideas are. Again, have they really changed? It is true that leading members of the Taliban, particularly on what was the military wing of this movement, which of course is now a cabinet, a government, if you like, an Islamic emirate, are on the United Nations and the US sanctions list. We tend not to have much to do with them. They don't really want to talk to Western media. And of course, one of the ways definitely in which the Taliban have changed is they're much more savvy about the media. Remember, this was a movement in the 1990s which smashed television sets, smashed cameras, didn't want any images. And now they've got their own social media units. Whenever I see Taliban leaders, one of the first things they do is ask me to follow them on Twitter. I interviewed someone just yesterday and he said to me, why don't you take a photograph of me? Will you put our interview on Twitter? And so they have a new language, a new way of communicating.
No other country currently recognises the Taliban government. Many BBC viewers are concerned that the BBC is normalising their views by giving them airtime. What would you say?
You know, it's hard. This word normal, there's nothing really normal about Afghanistan right now. But whether we like it or not, as journalists, we have to continue to cover what is happening in Afghanistan. Afghan journalists are covering it. Afghan media, international media have to keep an eye on the promises of the Taliban, what they're doing on the ground. This is not just an Afghan story, it's our story. And if it's our story, we have to cover it too.
Can I ask how far you know whether local Afghan journalists are still able to report and work?
Well, many have left or are trying to leave. Some have had direct threats. I continue to meet them. Last week, I spent time with one Afghan journalist who had said to me a month ago, he said, "Lise, I'm going to stay in Afghanistan," even though he saw most of his colleagues leaving or trying to leave. He said, "Do you think I'm stupid? Do you think," he said, I want to be here. And there are still journalists here, male and female, who say they want to be here. This is another turn of history.
Lise, you've been in Kabul. How far have you been able to report on what the new media savvy Taliban are doing away from the cameras in the rest of the country?
This is a time when it has become a lot easier to travel outside of Kabul. It's a lot easier in many ways to work in Kabul. The streets are calmer. The roads are open. They're bad roads, potholes. Some of them are almost not navigable, but you can actually go to many of the provinces now. I've been mainly focusing in Kabul, but many colleagues have been out to the provinces. Many are heading out now or have just come back. The roads are safer and they can move. So people are feeling now, Afghans and non-Afghans, now is the time to travel a bit more because the future still remains deeply uncertain.
I think it's fair to say that Newswatch viewers are particularly concerned about the safety of journalists there and particularly of women journalists like yourself. Can I ask how you feel personally about staying out there?
You have to make calculations. You have to be cautious. We never take security lightly. You have to basically draw on your resources, draw on what you know, draw on past experience, talk to a lot of people, most of all, talk to Afghans, and take calculated risks. There was always going to be a risk when the Taliban took over in power. In the same way, there was a risk when the last Soviet soldier left in 1989 when I was here, and everyone predicted dire consequences, said to me, "You're mad to stay in Kabul." And nothing happened. There were rocket attacks, but it was relatively safe. It certainly didn't collapse. It didn't do that until a few years. I was here in 92, when again there was another turning page and concerns about really chaotic and very risky situation. It wasn't at the moment, and it became later. Similarly, in this time, there was a concern that Kabul could descend into absolute chaos. It didn't. And we're still here. A lot of journalists have come and gone. So you make these decisions, you do what you can to prepare, you hope for the best and you prepare for the worst. And since I'm talking to you, Samira, I think I'd love to be able to say, not just on my behalf of the cameraman Robbie Wright, who worked with me, my colleague Sekunder Karmani and Malik Mudassir Hassan, we were all here together for many weeks. We were very touched that so many of our viewers sent us messages on email or on social media, and they were worried about our safety. So I think I'd like to use this opportunity to thank everyone for their concern and their care.
Lise Doucette, thank you. Thank you for all your comments this week. If you want to share your opinions about what you see or hear on BBC News on TV, radio, online and social media, email newswatch@bbc.co.uk, or you can find us on Twitter @NewswatchBBC. You can call us on 0370 010 6676 and do have a look at our website for previous interviews, bbc.co.uk/newswatch. That's all from us. We'll be back to hear your thoughts about BBC News coverage again next week.